Ladies and gentlemen, we have a distorted perspective on that which gives us life. More valuable than platinum, yet sold for a few cents a megalitre. We contaminate it, let it evaporate, complain when it dries up, and fear it when it overflows. We clean concrete with it and expect it to fill our glasses when we open our taps. Then we drive our cars to fuel bowsers, moan about how much it costs to fill up the tank, and on the way to the cashier, we buy a bottle of something from somebody else's tap for 6 times the cost per litre than the unleaded we've been complaining about outside. These are just some of the contradictions around how we use, abuse, and confuse the value of water. Hello, I'm Michael Mackenzie. I present RN First Bite on ABC Radio National. And welcome to On Water, in which speakers from various walks of life will break the seal and pour out the contents for just a few short minutes. It's an event presented by the Wheeler Centre and the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, supported by the Bank of Melbourne. We are on Wurundjeri land and we pay our respects to the elders both past and present. They are the traditional people who for thousands of years lived around Birrarung, the river that flows through this valley, fed by more than 50 creeks, streams and tributaries. However, in the last 200 years, it's been dammed for towns and agriculture, it's been tunnelled for gold mining, and used as an outflow for industry. And the speed of this river, that we now call the Yarra, has slowed. In fact, I could have jumped in for a quick swim earlier this afternoon near my place at Warrandyte, and 30 kilometres later, that same piece of water could be sliding past us right now. Now, there's an awful thought. Our first speaker will tonight help us unfold the history of water use where we stand. Genevieve Grieves was most recently the lead curator of Bunjalaka, the Aboriginal Cultural Centre at Melbourne Museum. She's also a filmmaker and a media artist, and Genevieve has previously worked with the Koori Heritage Trust as an oral historian, and then on both the Mission Voices website for the ABC and as a field producer on First Australians for SBS television. Right now, Genevieve is lecturing at the Australian Indigenous Studies program at Melbourne University. Her family is from the Worimi Nation in mid-north coastal New South Wales, so her upbringing is also woven in with water. Will you please welcome Genevieve Grieves.
It's very bright up here. Thank you and good evening. I want to talk a little bit about when I was a child and one of my favourite pastimes that I like to do in Sydney at that point, because that was my home city, that's where I grew up. I used to walk around and I'd imagine that every part of the city, every bit that was constructed around me, the houses and the roads and the buildings and the concrete, that they all fell away and that the land would return to what it once was. And sometimes it felt like that space that I was creating in my mind was in the future. Sometimes it felt like an act of reclamation, that the bush would take back the city. And sometimes it felt like I was in the past. And as many Aboriginal people are, often in the past and thinking of the time before, in our thoughts and in our dreams and in our imaginings. So tonight I'd like to take a moment and talk about this country and the theme of water, and imagine what this country was once like. So I want to remember what this place was, Melbourne, before Europeans came. And the act of remembrance is an act of acknowledgement, and I want to acknowledge this country and the people who belong to it, the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong, and their country men and women, the Tangarong, the Dja Dja Wurrung and the Wadawurrung. To all my nieces and nephews and sisters and brothers and aunties and uncles of the Kulin clans, I pay deep respect to you. I also want to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the room with us today, their elders and ancestors. But also I'd like to acknowledge Gary Presland, Bill Gamage and Kristen Otto, who have done much work in bringing the history of this place to life, and also Tony Birch, who has guided me and continues to guide me in this journey of uncovering and sharing the past. And finally, I want to acknowledge my own elders and ancestors. So what would we see if we imagined away the buildings and the concrete and all the structures that now cover Melbourne? Well, down near the corner of Russell and Exhibition Street, we'd see a small swamp. There was actually a beautiful creek that ran down Elizabeth Street, and it probably began around where the University of Melbourne stands, where I now work. And in North Melbourne, I just found this out recently, there was actually a huge lake called the Blue Lake. This is how it was described. It's a real lake, intensely blue, nearly oval, and full of the clearest salt water, but this by no means deep. Fringed gaily all around by pig's face in full bloom, it seemed in the broad sunshine as though girdled about with a belt of magenta fire. So Melbourne was a summer place. It was a place that people came to in the summer. Yams were dug and fish and mussels were got from the river. It was avoided in the spring when the taking of the eggs and young birds was banned. And it was a place of luxuriant grasslands. It was covered in rich grass. And this came about through a very involved and complex system of land management that existed across the country. It was a universal system enacted locally, as we now know from talking to or listening to Bill Gamage. And these grasslands existed because of this complex system of sustainability. And they existed to create an abundance of food and an abundance of life. So there was a staggering variety of foods available in this landscape and in the waterways of this country, which were rich with swans and geese and ducks and quail and wildfowl. And the rivers were rich with fish and eels that were caught in traps. And along the banks of the rivers grew murnong, which is a very important staple food, which was eaten raw or roasted and needs soft soil to flourish. And the Wurundjeri have started harvesting the murnong again on the Merri Creek. It's wonderful to see the murnong coming back to the creeks and rivers of Melbourne. Emus were so plentiful on these grassy plains that when Europeans arrived, they could actually shoot them lying down in their tents. There were so many emus and such an abundant amount of game. But the heart of this place we now call Melbourne was the river. When the settlers first came, they called it the Yarra River. They thought that was what its name was because they were asking people about it, and people said Yarra, but they're actually describing the movement of the water. They weren't actually describing the place, the river. There was actually no single name for the river. It had many names, giving voice to many connections, uses and understandings of this source of life. These days it's often known, quite unofficially, as Birrarung. In Indigenous terms, we talk about saltwater and freshwater people, and I come from both of those in my country. I'm very lucky. And this waterway, the Yarra River, holds both. There's warm, muddy fresh water on top and salty, clear, cool water below. The fresh water flowed down from the hills, from Warrandyte and above, and met the salt water coming in from the bay. And at that place where they met, there used to be beautiful falls, not that far from where we are now. So what did this river mean to the Kulin? Well, people camped by the river, they drank from it, they swam in it, they lived along it, and they were buried along its banks. It nourished and fed them and kept them alive. But it also created them. For many of the people of this land, this is where life originated. So Bunjil is the creator of this country, and he takes the form of a man or an ancestral being, an eagle, and he's also a constellation in the sky. And one of the stories of Bunjil, there are many, many stories and many differing stories, but one of the stories is that he created people from the mud of the river, of the Yarra River. So the river is the very foundation of being. And when the Kulin people looked at the river, reflected back at them was creation and the essence of life itself. And water is a very sacred element that is present in many ceremonies of welcome and belonging. Auntie Caroline Briggs, a Boonwurrung elder, she talks of a ceremony that involved a tarnak, which is a beautiful wooden bowl carved or created from the gnarls on gum trees. And there would be tarnaks, and water would be a very important part of ceremony to welcome people to these countries. And those ceremonies would take days and days to enact. But the river was also what drew the newcomers. So it wasn't so much the luxuriant grasslands, but the availability of fresh water. When Charles Grimes sailed this way from Sydney in 1803, he reported back that this was the site for a settlement. And very quickly, swarms and swarms of people came to this country, and it changed very drastically. So the removal of vegetation around the streams and the rivers took away the important food source of Murnong and also increased erosion. So that beautiful creek in Elizabeth Street ended up as a brawling, impassable torrent in winter and a snake-haunted gully in summer. That's how it was described. And the severe flooding of the new colony and the need for a port meant that the falls were destroyed and taken from Birrarung. And over the years since settlement, the river has become a reflection of many, many interventions. It's been filled with silt and sand, pollution, bacteria, and chemicals. When we do look into it today, we can see a growing consciousness of what sustains us and the need to care for it. You know, Birrarung is much cleaner and healthier than it was 50 years ago. But we are still a long way from seeing a reflection of ourselves that we can be proud of. We must once again see water as a sacred element of life, of creation, and of a shared future. That's it for me. Thank you.